What's going on, guys, and welcome back to another episode. Today is going to be a little different. Today I am going to narrate the 1970 strike. This is most likely designed for you guys as a listening as you deliver the mail today. It's Tuesday. The mail is not super heavy. So as you're, strolling the streets, take a couple minutes if you want and join me. A strike is called. Not surprisingly, New York was the center of drama, for the city itself had been a cauldron of social unrest, with protests against the Vietnam War, urban race riots, strikes by teachers, transportation and sanitation workers dominating the news for several years. Angry Branch 36 members had already raised their voices, protesting federal government's indifference to their plight and their own union's ambivalence, and then became enraged in early February 1970 when Nixon deferred a wage increase scheduled for January 1st. But the spark that lit the fuse was the news that on March 12th, a House committee approved a bill reflecting the Nixon-Rademacher Compromise. At the regular branch meeting that same day, Branch 36 President Gustav Johnson was interrupted as he delivered a report about the Nixon-Rademacher bill. Although the branch executive board had earlier directed stewards to tell carriers to oppose calling for a strike, angry carriers exploded with shouts of "No, no, not enough! Strike! Enough talk! Strike!" and demanded a strike vote. Raucous debate, verging on a brawl, ended with an agreement to meet again the next Tuesday, March 17, and hold a strike vote at that time. But with Branch 36 leaders, supported by Rademacher, dead set against a strike and fearful that a meeting might work to benefit of the more militant members of the branch, the officers arranged only for the vote. With members' credentials challenged in an effort to discourage voting and creating long lines at voting machines, the vote on March 17, 1970, at the Manhattan Center dragged on until around 10:30 p.m. Some 30 minutes later, the results were announced to the members. 1,555 yes, 1,055 no. NALC's largest local, chosen by a 3-2 margin to strike against the United States government, regardless of whether the National Union joined the strike. Johnson told the cheering members there will be no mail delivery tomorrow in New York, adding, "Your voice has been heard tonight." The leader of the New York metro area postal workers, the union representing the inside workers in the post office, said his members would honor carriers' picket lines even though they could not vote whether to strike until the union's next regular meeting in 3 weeks. But Brooklyn's Branch 41 president immediately announced that his carriers would join the strike. Letter carriers had taken a stand. The long-threatened strike was on. Since Branch 36 had night routers, the strike began throughout Manhattan and the Bronx earlier than elsewhere in the New York area. At 12:01 a.m., March 18th, members of Branch 36 set up picket lines outside post office, and although not all members had voted, almost every letter carrier in Branch 36 stayed out. Immediately, over 25,000 postal clerks and driver members of the giant Manhattan Bronx Postal Union honored the picket lines. And later in the morning, when carriers in Brooklyn and in many parts of Long Island, northern New Jersey, and nearby Connecticut should have reported to work, many of their branches joined the strike. And then the wildfire swept the nation. Branch 34, Boston, Massachusetts. Branch 156, Philadelphia. Pennsylvania, Branch number 1. Detroit, Michigan, Branch 40. Cleveland, Ohio, Branch 84. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Branch 214. San Francisco, California, Branch 9, Minneapolis, and Branch 26, St. Paul, Minnesota. Branch 47, Denver, Colorado. Branch 11, Chicago, Illinois. In the large and small communities alike, from coast to coast, letter carriers and postal clerks walked off their jobs, joined the picket line, and dug in for the duration. By March 23rd, the strikers numbered over 200,000 strong. Almost immediately after Branch 36 set up the picket lines on March 18th, the Nixon administration began maneuvering to crack the workers' revolt. Government lawyers in New York obtained an injunction ordering a return to work, but Branch 36 strikers defied the order. As the walkout spread, more court orders were issued, and local NALC leaders found themselves in a nearly unprecedented and certainly uncomfortable position of seeking legal aid and in some cases dodging federal process servers. As the strike reached across the country, NALC President James Rademacher was caught between his loyalty to his members and his concern for the union's future. The incendiary rhetoric he had employed in New York the previous year, when in the aftermath of the two job actions in Bronx, he had vowed to lead a strike if paid legislation was not enacted within a few weeks. Rademacher understood all reasons why his members walked off their job to fight, yet he feared that if he assumed leadership of the Wildcat strike, making it official, the government would totally crush the union, bankrupt it with fines, and padlock its office, strip away its jurisdiction, jail its officer, and fire its members. Rademacher later would acknowledge that there are times when workers have no choice but to strike. He simply felt that the morning of March 18 was not such a time. Trying to escape his dilemma and end the crises, Rademacher first attempted to persuade the strikers to return to work. After being assured by the Nixon administration that negotiations would begin once the strike ended and only then, the NALC president carried the message to an emergency meeting of presidents of the union's 300 largest branches on March 20th in Washington, D.C. He personally urged the presidents to call their members back to work so he could pursue negotiations, and in a spirited, noisy session, hundreds of local leaders accepted the idea with this provision. If agreement was not reached in 5 days, NALC would stage a nationwide work stoppage. The next day, Saturday, March 21st, Rademacher sent a telegram to all 6,500 NALC branches outlining the plan. Return to work on Monday and allow 5 days for negotiations before taking a nationwide action. But the back-to-work appeal had virtually no impact on the picket lines, because for many of the strikers, the Wildcat was aimed at much of the union's failures, and it was at the government's. At a meeting of Branch 36 the same day, the members voted almost unanimously to stay off the job, and across the country other branches voted no, walked out, or stayed out. His efforts at persuasions having failed, Rademacher turned on the strikers. At a press conference Sunday, March 22nd, he charged that New York City walkout has been instigated partly by subversion element members of the left-wing Students for a Democratic Society. Rademacher also threatened Branch 36 leader with expulsion from the NALC and set national officers out to the field to quash support for the strike. But on the picket lines, most striking carriers and clerks were not listening to the administration's promises, nor those of Rademacher. For despite of the pleas from the National Union, fewer than 60 of some 200 branches out on strike returned to work. President Nixon, with business interests clamoring for action and the effects of strike rolling across the country, went on the offensive on March 23rd in an effort to end the crises. On nationwide television, Nixon took his case to the American people and declared a national emergency. He also ordered 25,000 soldiers into New York City to move the mail. Not since Grover Cleveland became the first president to order troops to break a strike by calling infantry, cavalry, and artillery units to end the 1894 Pullman Railroad strike in Chicago, had a president resorted to such a desperate and ill-conceived move. The troops were ineffective. They never moved much mail, as shipments have been embargoed across the country, and the military units had none of the skills craft workers possess. Still, Nixon's use of soldiers as scabs his implied threat to send troops to other cities, the mounting legal pressure and threatened fines, criticism of the Wildcat action by AFL-CIO President George Meaning, plus Rademacher's appeals and claims of progress, together convinced many postal workers to return to work, but not the strikers in New York City. It was only when the officers of Branch 36, relaying information provided by the union national leadership, assured the striking letter carriers that an agreement had been reached with the administration that seemed to meet nearly every demand, did the carriers and clerks in New York City put their picket signs down and return to work. But no such agreement existed. For what became known as the Phantom Package was simply NALC's proposal: a retroactive 12% pay increase, fully paid health benefits, an 8-year pay scale, collective bargaining with binding arbitration, and full amnesty for strikers. Whether this was a deliberate deception, as many believed at the time, or a misunderstanding, the effect was an end to the strike. The New York carriers never formally voted to return to work, but the 8-day revolt was over. First to go out and last to go back, New York City letter carriers had shown a resolve and courage that would not be forgotten. As soon as the New York strikers returned to their job, Rademacher and other postal union leaders, assisted by AFL-CIO, began round-the-clock negotiations with the Post Office Department. By April 2nd, the parties reached an agreement they believed would satisfy the demands of the carriers and the clerks, who at great personal risk had defied both the federal government and their national leaders. The MOU expressed postal unions and the department's accord in 4 basic areas: pay increasing totaling 14%, 6% retroactive to December 27, 1969, and another 8% effective whenever a postal reform bill was enacted. Support for the establishment of an independent postal authority, collective bargaining over wages, hours, and working conditions with unresolved issues to be settled through final and binding arbitration, and compression of the time required for postal workers to reach the top step of their grade level from 21 years to 8. Congress quickly approved the 6% retroactive pay increase, and this became law on April 15th. Obtaining congressional approval of the remaining elements of the MOU proved more difficult, and it was not until August 12, 1970, that the Postal Reorganization Act became law. Letter carriers and other postal workers had at long last achieved full collective bargaining with their employer. Rademacher himself would be partly vindicated, for as the decades ahead proved, the postal reform legislation he had supported brought collective bargaining to postal employees, freeing them from collective begging, the total dependence on the good wishes and wisdom of their elected representatives. Still, only with the strike could carriers have achieved substantial economic and legislative gains. The long struggle of letter carriers for dignity and justice had taken a great step forward. The strike, what the news magazines at the time termed Revolt of the Good Guys, was an uncoordinated, spontaneous uprising of aggrieved workers, logging not only for economic justice, but also for a voice and recognition of their dignity and humanity. For many letter carriers, it was also a protest against local and national leaders whose concern for their members was outweighed by their understandable fear of what an all-powerful federal government could do to their union and their own liberty. As a result, they vacillated while the anger and resentment of the carriers in New York and elsewhere in the country grew. In the end, the strikers changed the Postal Service and their union, and yet the struggle for dignity and justice would continue in years ahead on different battlefields and with different weapons. Quite interesting. Branch 36 were the first ones to say they were not going back to work, and they were the last ones to come back. Here's one last thing. This is a quote. It says, Bill Braganese said it best. In fact, said it so well that today, years later, I remember it word for word. The first time I finally felt like a human being, he told me with tears in his eyes, on the afternoon of March 18, 1970, as we walked up and down East 45th Street in front of Grand Central Station Post Office in Manhattan, where we worked together for more than 2 decades. Bill, always the perfect carrier, on time all the time, and me, always the cut up and far from perfect. Shortly before midnight, I walked across Manhattan towards Grand Central Station Post Office on the east side with two other Grand Central carriers, Eddie Morris and Charlie Sprinkle. Eddie and Charlie had grabbed sheets of oak tag from my truck, picket signs, and we carried some wooden barriers used earlier that day for a St. Patrick's Day parade over to East 45th Street outside the post office. At midnight, about 100 night letter carrier routers and all clerks and other postal employees poured out of the building to join us, and every carrier and every clerk just coming to work honored the line. Personal recollections of Vincent R. Sombrado, Branch 36, New York, New York. And if you guys don't know, Sombrado actually became our president, I believe, in 1978 all the way to 2002. I just think this was a great story to share. Take with it as you may. Take what you want and leave the rest. Guys, enjoy your day. Be safe out there. Until next time, I'll see you. I'll be here. You'll be there. Peace.